welcome to episode 121 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley, California.
And I'm John Dinning in Los Angeles, California.
There's a different Los Angeles that I wasn't informed of?
Is there a different Napa Valley?
Probably, yeah. I think Napa's less famous than LA.
I would imagine so.
John, so what is going on?
Well, like we're in this exact same position staring down the barrel of an upcoming test week. I guess we were. The most recent thing was scores came out last week from October, which I got a lot of happy updates from. I'm sure you did too.
Yes.
And now we're a few days out of November.
I thought performance on that test looked pretty good overall. From students that I was talking to who seemed pretty happy, which has been a pretty good barometer in the past of the actual numbers and how they ultimately play out. So still the numbers are coming in, and we're looking at those, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a few minutes. But overall, it seemed like fairly good results.
I thought so too. I'm about to have some proper deja vu, in fact, because what I was drinking last Wednesday is exactly what I'm drinking right now.
What are you drinking then?
I'm drinking, I almost said a bottle of mezcal. I'm drinking a glass of mezcal from a bottle of Criente Tobala that I picked up down in Mexico City last week.
Yes, you went to Mexico and sent me some pictures.
Day of the Dead. Boy, they do Halloween big time down there.
Yeah, that's one of my most favorite holidays. So I think that's a really cool one. Good for you to be able to go down there. And I heard you took a hot air balloon ride.
Yeah. Somebody woke me up at 4 a.m. to jump in a hot air balloon over some ruins. And it was spectacular. But I'm still behind on sleep from it.
Yeah, it does sound spectacular. You won't find me in a hot air balloon, but that's just me.
Yeah, I figured my pictures are about as close as you were going to get.
That's exactly right. The pictures were great, though.
Yeah.
And somebody woke you up. I'll leave that alone.
So that's my drink, transitioning quickly. What do you got?
Well, we're going to talk about an idea that stems from ancient Greece, which amazingly enough still has LSAT application. So I went for the national drink of Greece, or really the most popular worldwide Greek drink, and that is ouzo.
Yes, sir.
Which is definitely a sipping kind of drink, not a heavy drinking drink.
I've tried it both ways.
Yeah, it is. It is clear. Correct. I couldn't even tell you what it is. It's a bottle with a blue label on it, and this is a very licorice-y kind of taste to ouzo, but it is very good.
Yeah, I don't hate it. I don't think I could drink more than a couple. I know we did drink a lot of it in Greece, so.
Yeah, it's not something that I would drink a tremendous amount of, but having a glass or two, I think is great. And I think that's often how they drink it, although I can't be totally certain.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say the same for mezcal.
So speaking of music, you were a huge proponent of this song and this artist.
How dare you?
So why don't you tell me what it is that we're listening to?
It was my idea. I'm not a little bit ashamed to admit, I guess. The idea that we're going to discuss today, so no one thinks I'm just a monster fan and that's why this is happening.
Sure.
We're talking about the idea of Pyrrhic Victories, which, as we'll explain, is really the notion of cost-benefit analysis and trying to move forward while at the same time feeling like there's some degree of loss or retreat. So I just kind of made the offhanded comment a little while ago about taking one step forward, 2 steps back. And I said, like that Paula Abdul song. And so sure enough, the song of the day is Paula Abdul. The song's called Opposites Attract, but it was that lyric that reminded me of it.
Yeah, that's a well-known lyric from that song. And I think it actually does very much match the thematic idea of what a Pyrrhic victory is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just, when we get to that segment. Let's get into the LSAT world, talk through some of the interesting things that have been going on since we were last doing a podcast, and then we'll get to the Pyrrhic victory discussion.
Yeah, and there's a couple of pretty sizable updates here.
They're huge, actually.
Yeah.
So the first one is that, there's been a lot of conversation around the idea of LSAC possibly changing the logic game section in 2024 at the very earliest. So first off, those of you who've been asking, is this happening next year or will this affect my test? No. There's not going to be a change in 2023. And if there were any type of change coming, whether that's 2024 or 2029, they will give a long run-up, minimum of 6 months letting us know that that's what's actually happening here. But they're clearly exploring it. We saw that kind of crazy fourth section back, I think, in June, where they just said, this is experimental and asked you some different types of questions. Now they're making it a more formalized test. And this is what happens in the process. A little bit of internal testing, a little bit with test takers, and then all of a sudden what they call a formal field study. And so on December 16th and 17th, they're going to do an analytical reasoning field study. And analytical reasoning is the section that we all call logic games. This is going to be 3 sections. One of them is going to be a traditional normal logic game section. That's clearly kind of like the default testing diagnostic section, so to speak. It is from a real LSAT. They are going to release it after the test. So that's actually kind of cool. The other 2 sections, and wherever they may appear, are actually these new practice type sections where they're looking at different types of questions. And we talked about this on the podcast when we reviewed that test. They tend to be either more simplified logic games or longer, more complex logical reasoning questions. Mm-hmm. We'll see if they stick in that same vein or whether they pull out even new, wilder types of questions, because I don't think that what they did back in June was really groundbreaking. It was just an alteration. Maybe we'll see more this time around.
Yeah, it seems like we almost have to. And it's interesting the way they're laying this out with like a control group, basically, of normal games, and then 2 experimental sets. Experimental in the sense of them being tested.
Yeah, and so that's coming up on December 16th and 17th. It's open to anyone who has an LSAC account, and it's done via ProctorU. So if you're taking January or a later test, sign up for it. You get a free logic game section under actual test conditions with proctors and so forth. Nothing counts here. There's not going to be a score that's produced. You will not ever have these results shared with law schools. It won't show on your permanent record that you took the field study. So if you're taking the LSAT January or later, go ahead and take this. I think it'd be a great idea.
Is that the case, Dave, that they won't even give users the results, like a raw score?
I think they'll give you, you'll be able to figure out what you did on the logic game section. That is the baseline section. They're not going to give you the results for the experimental type questions that they're looking at. That would be a problem for them, I'm sure. They haven't addressed it. It just makes sense that if they're going to release the real section, you will at the very least be able to figure out a lot of what you did, if not all of it.
I was able to participate in the first digital test pilot program, as they called it. And it's a pretty cool experience just to feel like you're really on the bleeding edge of the future of this test. To be one of the first to get to sample, it's pretty neat. And they let us keep the stylus.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Everybody got themselves an LSAT pen type thing. Big victory for all of you.
Yep.
So that is the field study, December 16th and 17th. Go to your LSAC account, and you should be able to sign up for it there. I don't know how long the sign-up will last, but right now, the last time I checked, it was available. And speaking of available, they also made something else available to us.
Yes, they did. Out of the blue, really. Last week, they released a brand new full 4-section official practice test. PT 93 plus. The plus they're designating that there's an experimental section included.
That's exactly right. And that was a bit of a surprise.
I'll say.
But I do think that they felt like we need to release at least one test each year to keep, to feel like we're keeping it honest. So they didn't give a whole lot of advance warning. I can only suggest to them in the future that they do so, because then students, can make certain decisions ahead of time about the studying that they're doing. Because for a lot of students, the first question I got was, I didn't plan on this test. Should I take this in place of, 92 or 90? So maybe a little advance warning. You're doing a good thing. Why not capitalize on it? Mm-hmm. Why give 24-hour notice and then make students who are taking the LSAT in November have to struggle a little bit with their schedules? At the same time, I'm still happy they released it.
Yep.
I just wish they would, work it out with the timeline.
A little more communication.
Why so last minute? Yeah. Why it's so last minute with so many changes that are made? It just doesn't make sense to me. It's not a great strategy. And I hope they're listening and they hear this because I'm speaking to you.
Yeah, that's not for the normal listener out there. That was purely for LSAC.
No, sure was.
This was a test that as soon as we saw it, we were able to pretty easily identify. It's a test we're really familiar with, in fact. These were test forms, scored sections from, most recently, I think, the June 2020 flex test, the second of all the flexes. But originally, we saw this content as the February 2011 LSAT. So this one's got quite a storied history to it over the last 11 plus years.
Yeah, and the experimental section was from February 2012.
Mm-hmm.
It was previously a scored logical reasoning section, now being released as the so-called plus experimental on this particular test. And we've seen these questions, especially from the scored portions before. In fact, I think one of the things that I'd counted out was that it had been used 7 times. Maybe you were the one that counted it out 7 times over the last 2 years at various junctures.
I might even take the over on that one. I'd say at least 7. They love this test.
Yeah, it had been used all over the place. Makeup tests, retests, international tests. It was floating around. Somebody asked me on Reddit, hey, can you list those out? And I was like, no. I mean, I have them. I'm not going to, because one of, the multiple competitive advantages we have is all this information about test administrations, which is what we use in our crystal balls to try to figure out what's going to actually, be used this next time around, or at least the crystal ball webinar, I should say. And so ultimately, I declined to share that information because that's it's out there if you can track it, and we did track it. And so unfortunately, I'm not going to share that, but it's been used quite a bit, and I think that actually drove part of this decision. A test that's been used that much has less utility going forward, simply because they're not able to use it as frequently. So that's a great candidate to be released.
Yeah, I like this test quite a lot. It's very fair. The most recent time we talked about it in full was back on the June 2020 podcast episode. I also, Dave, while you were talking about that, just looked it up. Including June 2020 to the present, it's been used 8 times. So possibly more, 8 that we're certain about.
See, that's perfect, because I said since June 2020, it's been used 7 times. So look, I was right too.
Well, let's keep talking about how right you are, because we did a scoring scale prediction on this test. And let's gloat for just a second. We had predicted this as a -8. You could miss 8 questions to get a 170. And the way this particular test scale came out, a 170 wasn't actually a result that you could get. This happens sometimes at the upper and lower ends of the bell curve, basically. Numbers in the 120s, numbers in the 170s, sometimes they're just not attainable because they don't have enough people there to spread them out fully. But
yeah. It's also a problem that, when you had 100 questions that were scored, you're putting the 100 questions and spreading them out over 61 possible scores. Now you have around 75. So sometimes, especially at the upper and lower ends of the scale, they will just drop scores. They don't often drop 170, though, because it's such an important marker. Mm-hmm. So on this test, if you got a 169, if you'd gotten one more question correct, you would have moved to 171, kind of like the ultimate bonus right there. So how did it play out? We said -8 for a 170. 170 was impossible.
So instead of a 170, it was -8 for a 171. I don't know how we could have been closer than that.
I think I said that on Twitter. I was like, given the fact that 170 doesn't exist here, and there's no way for us to anticipate that. There's no information, and there's no way to figure it out as to which scores aren't going to occur before they actually release it. I think we got as close as we possibly can. I take it as a win.
Yeah, I phrased it slightly differently to someone. I said you could miss 8 questions to get into the 170s, which was also true.
Is that our new language for the scale predictions? To get into the 170s, it's 8. That would certainly cover us, but I don't want to play those kind of word games.
I don't either. Any language that suits us, I'll take it. But in this case, I was not only happy to see that we were right, because it means our estimations about the rest of that test clearly were pretty spot on. But it means that LSAC's not doing anything terribly mysterious or capricious here. They're behaving in the way that we have been predicting them to.
Yeah, and honestly, we're making predictions over the last year. We don't get to see any of the tests, and so the question always comes up: are we still on target with it? It's one of the most common questions that we get, and I would say that this is absolute proof that we are. So that's the good news there.
I thought so too. I just keep setting you up with transitions. I'll do another one, speaking of good news, because I know you want to talk a little bit about some of the cycle data and numbers that we're seeing so far. I think most people listening to this will be happy about what you have to say.
Yeah, and I put out a tweet yesterday or the day before that has been doing some serious, volume, at least in the LSAT world, talking about applicants and what's actually occurring. So let's just we have enough data now where we can kind of see the way things are starting to shape up. It is still early. Things can change. Let's talk a little bit about what the applicant numbers are, and they are still volatile. Right now you've got about 14,700 applicants in the system. You're going to get a lot more. That's, maybe a quarter. It's not even a quarter of the way through this. Compared to the prior year, the numbers are down 10.7%. It means there's 10% fewer students applying to law school right now. It doesn't tell us about next month, but right now as compared to last year. And somebody asked me what that meant when I said that on Twitter, and they were confused by it. I was like, look, it just means less competition for what is largely the same number of spots. So if you're applying this cycle, this is a positive. What you want to see is fewer people competing with you. What you don't want to see is what we had 2 years ago when we had this massive run up and all of a sudden the cycle became incredibly competitive because there were so many extra applicants and LSAT scores. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, in Canada, the last reliable number was down about 35% from Canadian applicants into U.S. law schools. There's been a data blip right now. It shows down 81%, but it's not. They're missing some numbers there. It didn't just drop 50% overnight. Or if it did, we'll see that that's the case in a couple of weeks when it all cleans itself up. The other thing that really hurt applicants 2 years ago was not just the increase in applicants, but the increase in applicants with high LSAT scores. And this year, we're starting to see a decline in that. For example, the number of applicants between 160 and 164, they're down 16.4%. So if you think about that, applicants in general down 10%, and now you have people in the 160 to 164 range down 16.4%. There's fewer of them relative to the drop as well. 165 to 169 is down 19.9%. 170 to 174 is down 11.5%. So all of those numbers are even dropping faster currently than the applicant numbers. And 175 to 180 is closer. It's down 7.2%. But I will note that that's the smallest number of all of those. And so it is more volatile. Tends to move around a little bit more.
Yeah. So what you're really seeing there, to summarize, and you tell me if I've missed it, from about a 160 to a 174 or so, you've got smaller percentages of a smaller group, basically.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Fewer applicants and fewer higher scoring applicants. So if you're an applicant who is 160 or above and you're in this cycle right now, that's the double whammy of good fortune. That's like, fewer people to compete with. And out of those people, not as many of them have high scores as in the past. So that's pretty cool. Now, we're not done, though, because November is obviously coming up at the end of this week. And right now, you've got about just under 26,000 people registered for that test, which is a lot. Last November, we had almost 24,000 that were registered. We're going to lose some here in the last week. Probably the most interesting thing that we'll see is what the ultimate test-taking number is. Mm-hmm. That's probably what I'll track the most, because when we look at October, there was almost 1,000 fewer people that showed up for the test than were registered, which is a big, big drop. That kind of discrepancy doesn't exist in any test over the past year and a half or so. So I'll be really interested to see what happens in November. I have a feeling that the registration will keep dropping as people say, I don't want to take it. And then the test takers who actually show up to do it will be even lower by a significant proportion. So we are probably going to end up with maybe a slight increase in LSAT takers, but it won't matter because a lot of these people are retakers. Mm-hmm. If applicants are dropping and your number of LSATs taken is stable or up slightly, it means that more people are retaking the test. It's kind of an interesting fact there. It's hard to read sometimes.
Well, there you go. Like I said, I think most people listening to that would feel like, unless they applied last year, I feel like that's probably pretty good news.
Yeah, if you want to ignore all the numbers, what you would say is it is good news. If you're in the cycle, it's a great thing. What does it mean for next cycle? We don't know yet.
Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, it's too far off right now to predict what will happen next year. Do I see some huge increase? No. Do I see a huge decrease? No. But this is better than it was 2 years ago. This is better right now than it was last year, so things are improving. That's the takeaway.
I like it. All right, last thing, and then we can get into the real meat of this conversation. And we mention this most episodes. I think we really have to here because we have a special one coming up. Let's talk a little bit about some free webinars that we have on the docket. The next one is a couple of nights from now, actually. It's a comparative reading passage, reading comprehension webinar. That's on November 9th. And then there's a couple of weeks off for holidays and things. But on November 29th, we've got a Logic Games webinar on circular games. That was a lot of fun. I think you designed a game for that one, actually.
I did.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Look, yes, it is. So watch out. And then something that you didn't just design, you'll be there for, and so will I. 1 month from now, I believe it's that soon, we're doing a crystal ball again. A crystal ball webinar for the January and February 2023 LSATs.
And that is December 8th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. And as always, that initial seminar, webinar will be free to the public. So come on down, check it out, see what we had to say. We've been, as we just were talking, pretty accurate in our predictions. In terms of scoring scales, we've been very accurate historically as well in terms of predicting what tests would be reused and making problem sets based on that. And we'll do it one more time in a month.
That's right. We now have a brand new test as well in our hands that we can include some details from. So updated data, there's going to be a lot of good stuff in that crystal ball.
Yes, I'd love to see the numbers update as we absorb that into kind of like the metadata set that we use.
Mm-hmm. All right. You ready? I might let you take some of the lead on the intro here since this whole conversation really was your idea.
No. Yeah, so it's really a weird thing. I was reading this, I live in San Francisco area. I'm not a 49ers fan, but of course the news that is constantly pushed towards me is 49ers oriented. And so I was reading this article on the 49ers and I came across this kind of like discussion or quote of King Pyrrhus, really an Egyptian president. Like, geez, I'm out of it. Greek president. I think the Pyrrhus made me think Egypt. But no, that is Greece. From like 280 BC. And he had gotten himself into a battle with the Romans. And he won 2 battles with them during what ultimately came to be called the Pyrrhic War. But in winning these battles, what happened was they suffered a really high number of casualties, just astronomically high. So they won, but the cost was enormous. And when he was informed of that particular news, he said, if I achieve such a victory again, we shall be utterly ruined. And I really love that idea in terms of that concept, because it's like you start thinking to yourself that you're trying to get something and win, and you almost go in at this win at all costs mentality. But sometimes the cost is too high. And the article actually was comparing the 49ers game to the Carolina Panthers game, so it became completely ridiculous. But at the same time, I immediately started thinking about the LSAT and what kind of Pyrrhic victories that we come across with students where they have beliefs or approaches or practices that are really focused on a certain type of outcome when they don't actually realize that that outcome that they're seeking or their behavior may actually be detrimental in an overall sense to what the greater war is that they're actually trying to fight.
Yeah, this idea of like reaching some threshold, achieving some victory at any cost. And the question then really just becomes, what exactly is the cost? Is the cost greater than the benefit itself? And that's obviously Pyrrhus's quote, which if you think about it, it's kind of an amazing thing to say. If we keep winning like this, we'll be ruined.
Yeah, and it's if you go in there and you have a 100,000 person army and you win a battle and it costs you 30,000 or 40,000 of your troops, you can't win too many more of those before the army's gone, and those victories will not be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the Persians at Thermopylae and things where it's like, man, what did that really cost us?
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of cool because, it's not really a concept that a lot of people think about. Clearly, Paula Abdul understood it when she said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It might even be a reverse of that. 1 step forward, at least 1 back. But we wanted to talk about a couple different areas where we could see it and almost classify it down into some broad mistakes that people make. And really the goal here is to say, think about all these practices that we're talking about. Think about the types of errors. Is there anything that you might be doing in your preparation that mirrors this, or that you could think, wait, I'm actually hurting myself, even though it looks to me like I'm helping myself? That's kind of the goal, is self-analysis out of this, and just to see some of the types of mistakes that we've seen students make and see whether any of them happen to apply to you. And if they do, change that behavior immediately.
I said to you, Dave, when we were first discussing some of this, that I was excited to get into it because it does have this very almost like militaristic type of strategery to it. Thanks, George. Um, Knowing what to sacrifice and how to adjust, make battle plans and things, how to pivot midstream, even when to retreat, a tactical decision like that. These are central to success on the test because there is no such thing as like a static, all-purpose template of a plan. It's shifting and organic, and you need to know what it's going to cost you to achieve certain things. So
Yeah,
that's really what a lot of this is to me.
and I really like that. And a lot of times people think retreat is an automatic defeat. That's not what that means. Sometimes retreat is actually a feint where you're like drawing people in. Sometimes I think about it. I watch a lot of soccer, football for those of you outside the U.S. and Australia. And, oftentimes a back pass, you're not giving up. You're just reallocating, reorienting, and attacking from a different point. And that's the same type of idea that can come into play here is if you're doing these things, maybe you need to take a step back and think, is there a better way to attack these issues?
Yeah, it's a little bit of that like live to fight another day kind of thing. So we broke this down categorically into things, but I think anyone listening to this is going to find as we go through it that all of these things collectively just make up how it is that you should approach the test, from your prep to how you study to what you actually do in the moment testing. All of this kind of fits into that same spherical idea.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways these all kind of have common touch points. Let's start off and talk a little bit about timing as it relates to like sections and tests and doing the pace that you actually take with this. And the first example I'll give is that sometimes I run into students who are saying, I'm going to make sure that I complete every single question in a game. And, they're able to successfully achieve doing that. But then as it turns out is they've spent so much time on that single game that they can't finish the section, which ultimately hurts their overall score. And if you think about it from a timing standpoint, most timing problems are going to be about being too slow or too fast. It's a great example where, wanting to be really thorough causes you to go too slow. And then ultimately you think, well, I got everything right in that game, but your overall section score suffered. And there's the Pyrrhic victory. Championship win on the game level, overall loss.
Yeah, absolutely. On a section level, that's right. Ditto things like getting bogged down on, say, a single question in logical reasoning. There is a reason they use parallel reasoning questions in the late teens and early 20s so often. It's because they realize people are going to sacrifice multiple questions getting stuck, bogged down in the volume of a parallel, especially if they haven't listened to our podcasts on parallel reasoning and don't know how to do them.
Which they should. From an early episode, like 3 or 6 or something like that.
Yeah, we hit that right out of the gate. But it speaks again to the point is know what you're getting for the investment, but also know what the investment costs you. If a game costs you more than the game gives you, if a question costs you more than it gets you, in that case, just a single point, you need to ask whether it's worth it.
There's also a mistake that occurs that I see a lot in the reverse, which is that people get fixated on the idea of, I've got to finish the section.
Yeah.
Now they're saying to themselves, a lot of times in logical reasoning is where I see this, I've got to finish all the questions. And they begin rushing to do just that. And then in the process, they begin missing a bunch of questions because they missed too many details by trying to go so fast. And, the first mistake was really you went too slow. Now you've gone too fast. But these overarching goals are really good ones. Get all the questions in a game right. Finish all the questions in a section. But that's not always optimal for every single student. You have to look at what your strengths and weaknesses are and think to myself, am I pushing myself in a way that is just not natural for me? Maybe it'd be better to do 22 questions in a logical reasoning section and get almost all of them right than to do 26 and, miss a third of them.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this with students, that there's kind of a sweet spot here, some nexus or Goldilocks zone of going at the right speed so that you can get as much done with as great a degree of accuracy as possible. So again, it's a tricky one, this idea of trade-offs, because it's, there's a problem that's sacrificing multiple questions for the sake of just one, on the one hand, or sacrificing accuracy for the sake of speed. On the other, they both can create situations where your costs outweigh the benefits, where the victory you've achieved is Pyrrhic.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, our use of Pyrrhic here is more just the general concept of the high cost of doing business inside of, the LSAT. It's not exactly a Pyrrhic victory. The victory would be to have, gotten the entire section right, but then, struck out on some particular game or had certain problems that really hurt you elsewhere on the test or in life. And so it's not exact, but it's the idea of, hey, are some of the practices that you're taking detrimental to the overall goal that you have, which is to, in this case, in Pyrrhus's case too, it wasn't just that battle, it was the war.
Yeah, we were inspired by the idea of the Pyrrhic victory, and now we've taken some liberties with it. A Pyrrhic victory truly would be like, I studied so hard to get that 180 my wife left me. That's a Pyrrhic victory.
It really would be.
Or just a straight up victory, I guess, depending.
Depends on the person. For me, that would not be a victory. All right. So just something to think about it. Inspired by it. I don't want to hear any history majors who are like, that's not exactly a Pyrrhic victory. I'm like, look, that's not precisely what we're going for. We're aware of it. Let's move on to like another area that we see this happen a lot, not just, timing and pace, but just practice in general. The way students approach the idea of practicing for the LSAT. A lot of times, one of the most common ones that I see, John, is where somebody says, all right, I'm done with this. And, my schedule and the way I want to do this, even my personal interests say that I need to move on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. I need to move to the next type of question to study, or another section that I need to do, or take another practice test. Whether or not they're ready for it, they will say to themselves, I just want to move on too quickly. And of course, in doing that, there's that big risk of you've almost, again, moved too quickly, too fast, and you've set yourself up for failure because you didn't actually learn everything that you could have or needed to from that particular, question, section, practice test, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, we see this a lot of times in kind of the guise of achievement or accomplishment, where a lot of people just have these boxes they want to check. When I see someone say, like, I've done every practice test, or students in a class, like, I've completed every piece of homework, my immediate question is always, but how well did you understand it? It's a great achievement, don't get me wrong. I'm not sure I've done every practice test. But the bigger goal here, I think, is comprehension, not just this mindless consumption.
Yeah, if some student comes to me and says, oh, I've done every single test, I considered it to myself, I'm like, okay, so have I. So let's see how well you know it. Because that's going to be a conversation that'll be incredibly revealing, and it won't be broad. I'm not going to be like, oh, did you find this test hard? I'm going to be like, let's get into this concept and really break it down, or let's go look at this question and really break it down. If you've done it all, you should know it all. And what you often find in those conversations is after about 3 or 4 minutes, like, you know what, I need to go back into this and look at it a little bit more. And that's properly preparing and reviewing tests correctly. But don't just jump to the next thing because you feel like it's some kind of, I need to keep moving forward. That's a lot of times what people say is like, well, I don't want to be stagnant. Mm-hmm. Learning isn't stagnant. Studying the same thing multiple times isn't stagnant as long as you're pulling out new information from it. And you never know if it's going to be the second, third, or eighth time you look at something where the light goes on. It doesn't matter to me when the light goes on as long as it does at some point. If you feel like, look, I'm not going anywhere with it, well, then move ahead. But mark it, come back. Keep it as a problem area in the grand journal of things that you're tracking, and make sure that you're comfortable realizing, hey, I might have to come back to this.
Yeah, we'll talk more, too, a little later on about like quantity versus quality and how to prioritize that stuff, because that's part of what I think is involved in the discussion we just had. But for now, know that, again, comprehension of what you're doing is far more important than doing everything.
Yeah, and kind of like hand in hand with that, you talked about students who are like, oh, I've done everything. A lot of times I see students make a plan that is very rigid, months in advance. In 3 months on Saturday, I'm going to be taking PT 78. Okay, I'm for that as a rough guide, but plans need to change. And sometimes people will hold on to a plan to do certain things, to finish sections, to finish practice tests, to read books. For example, one of the things I often see, I see it on Reddit more often than not, is someone said, oh, it took me about a week to read the Logical Reasoning Bible.
Yeah.
I'm telling you right now, if I were to give that person a quiz about the contents of that book, they wouldn't know 50% of it. It's just the way that it is, because the nuance, which is really where the difficulty is and where I spent most of my time when I was writing that book, I know how deep it is because I had to sit there and work my way through it mentally in terms of structuring it, and I know how easy it is to miss. So all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I was able to speed through it. I was like, that is not going to be absorption. And of course, that's really related to that first point about, did you get everything out of it? Somebody who tells me they read the LRB in a week, even if they spent 10 hours a day on it, I guarantee they didn't get everything. I'd rather see someone read it over the course of a month and even put it down for a few days at a time and come back to it. Let the ideas sink in and then say, did I really get that? Some of the stuff in there is brutally difficult. Some of it less so. You go through the stuff fast that you can. Slow down when you get to some of the things, because things like conditional reasoning and what have you are so fundamental to this test that you have to make sure that you understand them perfectly.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, man. So it's great to have a plan. It's also great to be adaptable. And this idea of I stuck to my plan exactly. So again, it's a little bit like the guy telling me he's done every practice test. I'm like, at what cost? What did you really get from doing that? Was there an alternative that would have been better? It might not have looked as pretty on paper, but was there a different way to do this that wouldn't have cost you so much?
Yeah, and a lot of times people will ignore all the environmental considerations that they have. They'll think, I've got to do this because my schedule tells me to do it. Somebody who's a parent, for example, a couple kids, they thought that the kids were going to be out of the house, maybe with their partner. And then it turns out, no, the kids are not going to be out of the house, but they're planning to take a practice test. They're still going to adhere to it. And they take that practice test while there's noise and confusion and people ask them questions and looking for things. And then they don't score that well. And that's bad, because their immediate response is, what happened? And that a lot of times I'll get these messages that say, well, I did this and it really wasn't great, but I went down 3 points. Yeah. Like, you didn't go down 3 points. You got distracted by 3 points, at least, probably
you had
5
3
to 10.
It's not the same thing.
Yeah, even one kid is a huge distraction. 2 or 3, it's a force multiplier. It's, 4 times the distraction, 9 times the distraction.
I had a tutoring student of mine, who ended up pulling a 177 this October, but about a week before the test, she took a practice test and got like a 164, 165, and texted me in something of a panic. And she's like, did I forget how to read? What's happened to me? And I said, well, tell me about your day leading up to it. She goes, well, I hadn't eaten anything, and I took it at 6 p.m., and I'd kind of been in a fight with my parents. And I was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Did you really need me to help you figure this out? You gave yourself no chance of doing your best. But she had determined she was going to take a practice test that day, hell or high water.
And it turned out to be both. Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is it doesn't have to be kids or a fight, with your significant other or your parents or whatever. You might not be feeling well. It might be noisy. Your friends might have been like, come on, let's go out and party. And you're feeling, that you should have done that instead, and you're distracted. It doesn't really matter what the cause is. Take a look at what you're doing. Your plan is a basic prescription for what you're intending to do. It is not an absolute prescription. And you have the opportunity to change that, and you need to live your life. So, you have to be happy. That's the first rule of taking the LSAT to some extent, is be happy. Feel comfortable and calm. And then second, be confident.
Yeah.
You got to have those two things. If your mind isn't in the right spot to take this test, the test makes you pay, because it requires focus. And if you're suddenly thinking about, why did I say that to my girlfriend, or, why did my significant other say this to me? You're going to lose that point right there. And that's going to happen multiple times, as much as you think about it during an exam.
Yeah. How many times have you heard that quote post-test from somebody, that practice test, where they're like, well, I knew it wasn't going to go great, but I did it. And I'm like, let's reevaluate what you just said. Let's really consider that you're celebrating the completion of something you shouldn't have done.
Exactly. Don't take it on unless you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
And that also goes on for, people who start seeing themselves facing burnout. Most people know what the signs are. They look at the LSAT, or they look at one of our books, and they're like, no, I wish not to ever look at it again. They want to punch themselves in the face as opposed to doing another logic game. A lot of times people ignore that. They feel like they have to push through. And that's built around this idea of, to just do the work is valuable. Mm-hmm. I'm not a believer in that. Doing work just for work's sake is not beneficial. In fact, it can be indeed quite harmful. Do the work when you know you're going to get something from it. This isn't like chopping wood or mowing the lawn, where you can sit there and somewhat mindlessly, you got to be careful when you're chopping wood, but somewhat mindlessly do it and just kind of push the mower along. This is something where you have to be engaged with it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people come to me and they're like, well, I've been working 80 hours a week, and then I've been trying to do this, and I've been taking care of my sister, but I'm still trying to put in like 15 to 20 hours in the LSAT. I'm like, you're probably feeling pretty tired, aren't you? Yeah, but I still need to. I'm like, maybe you need to reallocate if possible. yeah, I won't have to take care of my sister next week. I'm like, why don't you just focus on her for now?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't recipes for complacency. We're not saying don't do the work. We're saying don't do the work for the work's sake. Do it because it's going to benefit you in some sort of, again, tangible, predictable, realistic way. Whether that's maybe not taking a practice test that you thought you would that day because of some circumstances, or whether it's actually taking a break because you can feel your mind and body beginning to rebel and betray you.
People are very anti-break.
Yeah,
Probably one
yeah.
of my top asked questions that I get wherever I may go, whatever forum, platform, whatever message I get. Well, do you think? And my answer is almost always, if you think that you might need to have a conversation about taking a break, you need to take a break. And then I always give them the same link, which is essentially a blog article I wrote, a long time ago that says why taking breaks from the LSAT, can increase your score. It's something like that. But it's essentially boils down to the idea of that taking breaks from the LSAT is actually, almost in most cases at least, helpful, not harmful. The very thing that they're fighting against doing because they think it will hurt them is actually hurting them by not doing it. I'm like, you're making your situation worse. Take 3 days off, take 5 days off. And sometimes it's liberating to hear someone else say that. So if you're feeling that way, even if it's November, if it's the November LSAT, take a day off. It's okay. It's better to have mental clarity and happiness than it is to have done, 2 more logic games that you didn't get anything from because it was just, you couldn't even read the words on the page.
Yeah.
You didn't want to.
Yeah, so many people see a few days off as some kind of surrender or some kind of like weakness, I think. I hear that from people sometimes, but like, I can't take a week off in law school. Don't I just have to grind my way through it? The grind.
You do get weeks off in law school.
And I'm like, you have to understand. First, it's a different process. You do get time off in law school, for sure. And the LSAT's a very unique journey. It's a very unique adventure that you're on here. Stop trying to compare it to things and just treat yourself better.
That's exactly right. So that's just kind of like a little overview of some of the things we see with people practicing and scheduling and so forth that really just fall into that last one is really rigidity. You're so rigid in terms of your thinking that you will not actually take what is staring you in the face and respond to it. Let's move on to some general preparation, just LSAT preparation ideas. And it kind of, harkens back to the very first one that we had. But one of the things that we see as an issue is people are prioritizing quantity, getting these things done, whether they're on a specific schedule or not. Doesn't matter whether they take a year, over quality. So a lot of people think the amount that I do is what determines my score.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that, but I've always said there's a kicker on that, which is it's the amount that you do that is of high quality effort. I would rather have somebody do 10 LSATs really well than just kind of 20 LSATs where they just kind of went through them, didn't really spend a whole lot of time with them and moved on.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, you mentioned a blog post that you wrote, Dave, about taking breaks. It's one of my favorites. I send that to people all the time. Unsolicited, I send that to people. I wrote one about this quantity-quality debate decision that I think really speaks to the same sort of thing. It's about recalibrating the way that you see what for a lot of people are myths about the things that they're supposed to do. I never give up. I never quit. You're not quitting. You're taking a couple days to just like refresh yourself. Or I'm going to do every single thing out there because then no stone's left unturned. Yeah, but you didn't even realize what kind of rocks you were kicking over. These are these, again, it's the illusion of some achievement that actually costs you so much.
Yeah, you're not retreating, you're reorienting.
Yeah.
You just have to, sometimes it takes perspective to think, in this case, Paula Abdul is reversed. 1 step back is 2 steps forward.
I should know that that's at least the second time you've mentioned Paula, and I haven't yet to. So
you just mentioned her again.
Now who's the super fan?
Not me,
Still
but
me.
You're the one that came up with the song choice, and you just mentioned her now, so
but
it's 2-2.
That song is catchy.
It truly is. She made a mint off that particular song, so good for her.
Did. But yeah, this idea of quality over quantity, it's just, again, it's a hard thing, I think, for people to concede. It's like, maybe I don't have to do everything, but if I just do this much well, it's enough. I don't have to do 8 hours a day every day for 6 months. Even though somebody on Reddit said they did, it's enough.
We'll come back to that.
I thought we might. Love the way you said it.
It sounded ominous.
We'll
It really
come back
isn't
to that.
ominous. What's the next one here, John?
I've just been teaching this class. We wrapped up about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And so it's very much on my mind watching some of the mistakes that people make, the well-intentioned, ambitious mistakes that people often make in these classroom settings, as you really do go from the fundamentals to the slightly obscure high-level stuff. And one of the ones that I cautioned them repeatedly against was this idea of trying to essentially achieve test day types of speeds, that ideal pace, before the concepts, techniques, strategies really are well established, before your process has reached a point of near perfection.
Running before you've learned to walk.
Yeah, or crawl in the case of a lot of people, yeah.
I like mine better. More positive.
They're both true, and mine's probably a little more patronizing. Oh, aren't you adorable? Crawling around. But the fact is, until you have built up to a level where you're proficient enough to do things correctly without a clock, the clock doesn't matter. Despite the fact that, I went so fast I finished under time. Yeah, but you missed 70% of it.
Yeah, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the clock is one of the most feared things about this test. It's also one of the things that you have to try to put it in the back of your mind, not the forefront. You can't think about time as something that is controlling everything, especially when you're studying. You have to look at it from the concept will ultimately control the time, not in the reverse. So if you can learn the concept and understand how to recognize and manipulate it, that will actually defeat the clock eventually.
Yeah.
That's a hard lesson though, because at first people are just looking at that clock thinking, I've got to go faster. I'm like, stop thinking about time. Stop thinking that you have to do this in 8 minutes and 45 seconds and focus instead on what are the elements that are present? How do they work together? How do you recognize the movement within them? And how do you, draw inferences and so forth from that? Once you are able to do that more quickly, and you're not thinking about the clock, it'll happen naturally as you study it more and more. Then all of a sudden you'll be like, I'm not having as much time troubles as I was before. Ignoring the clock is actually the right thing to do for almost everybody early on in their preparation.
Yeah, as I put it to the class that I taught, speed's not a goal, it's an outcome. When you understand what you're doing, when you're maximally efficient with your thought processes, recognizing what you're seeing and how to react to it, you can go as fast as you want. But until you reach that point, don't worry at all about pace. It's process.
Yeah, but a lot of times people are like, "Oh, I'm doing the section in time," and I'm like, "Yeah, but your outcome is not good.
Right.
That's not helping us at all." Again, it's a speed kind of element here, trying to go too fast, trying to rush. All right, let's move on to the next one.
I like it. And this gets a little more just into mentality, but I think it dovetails nicely with that idea of taking a break and being, call it self-aware, or just in touch with how your body and mind are reacting to things. And speaking of outcomes as well, one of the things that I always caution people about is putting too much stock, too much really emotional bandwidth into thinking about the score, the outcome of the test, rather than the individualized moment-to-moment decisions and behaviors that produce that score. It's really speed by another name, score. When you know what you're doing, speed takes care of itself, and so does the 180, or whatever number.
Yeah, scores are to almost everybody, they're the marker because they know that's the ultimate outcome. And it's very easy to get focused on that outcome and think, my score didn't go up as much. And one of the first questions I often tell or ask people when they come to me is, they take a first practice test and then 2 weeks later they take a second. They're like, my score only went up a point. And I never ask them anything more about, as long as I know that the two performances were roughly similar environmentally, I instead will ask them, how did you feel? Did you feel like you knew more about what you were looking at? And inevitably they say, yes, I did, but my score. And I'm like, okay, look, let's de-emphasize your score for a second because there are reasons that you wouldn't actually be improving your score yet. The fact that you felt better about what you were looking at, that's the moments inside your preparation. And that is a really important thing because you have to feel as if you're learning. A lot of times people don't value that. They're like, but the score.
Right.
It becomes this mantra that you hear.
It's funny when you think about it that way. It's almost reverse Pyrrhic, where in this case, there's a victory in the apparent defeat.
Yeah, but they're saying to themselves, I like that, that they know more, but they're worried that that's not good enough. I'm like, well, there might be reasons. One of the things that we see classically is that as you learn new things, You tend to slow down mentally until it becomes second nature. You might have been doing something wrong your whole life, but you can do it pretty fast. Now you're being taught in a way to do something correctly, but it's not comfortable. It's unfamiliar. You have to adopt it. So at first you're going to slow down. You may know more, but it may not show up in your score until later. Then a couple of weeks later, you're like, oh, I really understand this well. And it becomes second nature and you start doing it without thinking. And then you see that classic score leap. Well, I went from 153 to 159. How did I do that? Well, it all came together. It just took time for it to all come together. So focusing on the outcome is understandable, but it often isn't all that healthy.
Yeah.
Focus on whether or not the underlying moments in your preparation, the underlying knowledge base is increasing and getting better and becoming more rewarding, because that will ultimately lead to a higher score.
Yeah, that's so well said. This is precisely why we provide so much detail in the analytic feedback that we give when people take sections and practice tests and things on our sites. It's because if all we gave you was a number, it's pretty useless. Looking at you, Law Hub. But on ours, you can actually see literally down to the answer choice data. 17% of people picked B. Why was it that high? Why was it that low? This is what you need to understand if you're ever going to have a hope of reaching, let's just call it your full potential of a score.
And I will say we're rebuilding that analytics as we speak.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
it won't be immediate, but at a certain point down the line, there will be an entirely new analytics delivery that I think will be very focused and seamless. I'm looking forward to some of that coming out. But just a little sidebar, we're always working on various things. That's one of them right now.
I use the current system every day with people, and I love it. And I can say with full confidence the new system is going to be quite a bit better.
Which is always good news. Improvement is what we want, both for LSAT scores, for our course, for how we deliver it as well. Speaking of the idea of amounts, one of the things I often hear people talk about with preparation is that they're more concerned about how much money they spent versus what the outcome is. And I'm not an advocate that says, you have to spend thousands of dollars on LSAT prep. I wrote the LSAT Bibles precisely to, counter that mindset, which when I wrote them was very much en vogue.
You literally reinvented the market for affordability.
Yeah, that was, and that was a huge goal. And part of it was that I was tired of repeating myself. I always make that joke because I was like, someone would ask me about how to do logic games. And after a while, I was like, gosh, I've said this like 400 times. Maybe I should write it down and then I can just point at that and be like, read this and then we'll talk about it to save that. But a huge driver was, I wanted to make it more affordable. And even still, even at the prices that are much cheaper than they were, a decade or 2 decades ago in LSAT prep, I see this all the time, is that people will not look at the long-term outcome importance of their LSAT score, and they choose various moments to say, I'm going to save the money now versus save the money later. And of course, there's a degree of self-serving aspect to this, John. You and I do LSAT prep. We're big advocates of what we do. So I'll just put that out there. I don't care. And I'll tell you why that is the case. Because a lot of times thinking about the LSAT score is like, well, am I going to spend $100 now? Am I going to buy this book for $50 now or not? And it's easy to think, well, I don't need it. And then you get into law school and you discover that it's one of the most expensive endeavors you're ever going to engage in. And as it turns out, your LSAT score is hugely influential and important into not only the schools that you get into, but to the financial aid packages they offer you. And a lot of times it doesn't feel like 2 or 3 points right now would make a huge difference. Some people understand that it does. But financially, that $50 you might have saved could very well have cost you $5,000 or $10,000 or $25,000 down the line. Yeah, even more. And that to me is one of the things I often try to tell people is the reason I like what we do, aside from the academic and intellectual nature of it, is that if we achieve what our goals are in terms of increasing scores, it has a direct financial effect. You shouldn't ultimately think to yourself that your LSAT prep was a cost. It should have been an investment. Yeah, I invested $2,000 into it, but look what happened when the school came back and reduced the cost of law school by $100,000 for me. I'll take that every single day of the week.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just us trying to self-promote our own services here, this is all very quantifiable. Like, I don't even think it's controversial to say that every point on the LSAT translates into dollars in your pocket, both short-term and long-term. Again, I hat tip again to my student who tested in October with the 177. I more or less yelled at her to retake a 170. She had a 170. She was already in at a very good school. And I was like, take this test again. You have not tapped out. In fact, you're not that close. She said, but I don't. I was like, do it. Trust me.
No.
Do it.
I don't want to.
She did. And she texted me the 177. She goes, I guess you were right. And of course, she and I have a good relationship joking around. But in my head, I'm like, you guess I was right. That's probably a $200,000 score. Because she's going to go to that school for more or less nothing now.
Well, at this point, they have an incentive to kind of make it so she does go to that school. They want her. The score's even better. It's even better for their numbers. And so they will incentivize that. When you're starting this process out, that is such an easy point to miss and to not understand that there's almost a straight line correlation between LSAT scores and the debt that it's inverse really, but the debt that you will ultimately avoid. The higher your LSAT score, the less debt you will take on is really where it comes. And the reason for that is they'll give you more money.
Yeah.
Which sounds incredibly crass and commercialistic and even capitalistic. That's the way that it is. And it is not controversial to make that claim. It is out there 100%. And I don't think anyone who will argue with it with me, I'm like, okay, we're not going to have an argument. I'm just going to point you to statistics and it's game over.
It sounds a bit mercenary, but that doesn't make it any less true. And frankly, the debt that you do take on, you'll pay off faster because you get out of a better school with better job opportunities. This is all well documented. Like I said, it bears repeating because people lose sight of it, but the truth is undeniable.
It goes even further than that. It's been, the correlation between school ranking, however worthless it may be, and salary outcomes is also a very direct line, which means that you start making more right out of school. So you pay it faster, but that tends to propagate throughout your entire career. If you start at $170,000 in your first year versus you starting at $90,000 in your first year, come back 10 years later and what do you think it looks like?
Well, you've made $800 more thousand.
And you probably have not narrowed that salary gap, but for many people even made that salary gap bigger. So it tends to have that multiplier force effect that is kind of moving through this. And, we've done podcasts on that. I've talked about it in blogs before. It is the ultimate investment. And sometimes I see students saying, well, I didn't want to spend the money on a book, so I listened to your podcast. And I'm like, our podcast isn't a course. It gives you cool ideas, and it's, a great point to talk about some very specific concepts, but the courses are far more in depth.
It's not even close, but yeah.
Let's close this out with one more thing that is not self-serving.
Oh, all right. Like an Apple keynote. What do you got?
Self-serving, but true. I don't know how to classify that. I don't have any qualm about talking about that point because I think it's such an important one financially for so many people.
You could make the point that it's the most valuable thing someone's going to hear this whole discussion.
You actually said something earlier that you had this student who said early on they'd been using a lot of LSAT forums, Reddit, some of the other ones that are out there. And they really, at the very beginning of their prep, loved it. They loved seeing people enthusiastic about the LSAT and talking about it. And so it was kind of like a win for them. All right, other people are really into this too. Other people have these goals. It was very energizing. And now they've been preparing for a while. What's their view on, looking at forums at this point?
Well, again, to start with the illusory victory of this, it felt at the beginning stages, and I'm just quoting here, that it was immersive and I'm doing something productive and I'm becoming part of this community. And look at us, legal bros and sisters. We're doing all of this together. And this person stayed in there long enough and learned the test well enough and started to improve in certain ways that I think there was almost a toxicity that began to bleed back through. Essentially, what is it? Comparison is the thief of joy, as they say. I think it was this aspect that really started to weigh on his mind a lot. And it became a bit poisonous, frankly, treacherous, because he could not see other people's scores and performance and pace of improvement and somehow compare it to his own. So it went from this almost like idealistic, idyllic, I'm part of this group, to suddenly like, this group's making me feel real bad about myself. Not intentionally. It was all, again, sort of self-punishing, but it became a really problematic place to be. and a hard place to shake, frankly. I've been working to have him delete some tabs in his browser.
Well, that's not the first time or the last time we'll hear stories about, forums. And I think, a forum like Reddit or what have you can be such a useful place. It is really nice to hear other people having similar experiences to yours, to realize that there's some collective suffering in taking this test. And it's like you can take away the really good parts of it, and it's really useful. The problem is you run into this point of comparison. It's kind of how I feel about Instagram, which I really don't like to use or even look at, which is that everybody puts up their best moments. Oh, my score, I took a practice test today. It's 178. My first perfect on reading comp. And they'll talk a little bit about it, but then you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, my life's not that good. And it's like looking at Instagram. Oh, I'm traveling in Malaysia. Oh, that looks so cool. Well, you're stuck at home in Idaho or wherever you might be. It's a tough one. And so, if you're falling into that trap where it's becoming a Pyrrhic victory and some of the benefits you got are now being outweighed by some of the negatives, especially the emotional ones, get out of there.
Yeah, the feeling I have to keep my finger to the pulse of this, I have to stay in touch with what's happening with the people. As soon as you start to feel that that's kind of eating away at your own spirit or sense of like achievement, sense of maybe enthusiasm, then yeah, bail. And I promise you, half of what you're seeing in places like that, it'd be like if you thought every day of my life was a hot air balloon ride just because one morning last week I took some pictures.
Moments in time.
Yeah, it's not. It's a snapshot. But that's how I see some places like Reddit. One place I'll give some credit to, and this is a little self-serving as well, but I don't mind. I think our forum is easily the healthiest, most like collaborative, rising tide lifts all ships kind of place that I've seen. I don't see any snark. I don't see any of the people on there trying to outdo others. It doesn't feel competitive. It feels very much like we are a team. Maybe that has to do with the fact that they've come to a place that's a little more, I don't know, centralized than a Reddit.
It's more moderated, number one.
And there's that, yeah.
First off, there's a lot of our students on there asking questions about our approaches, our explanations for questions. And then you get people like myself and other instructors who are like, let me answer this for you. And typically there's a much higher percentage of actual LSAT teachers interacting in there in terms of the number of posts than you would see on a place like Reddit just by, sheer volume. I think that makes a real big difference because you're talking to people who are actual professionals in terms of doing this, whereas Reddit, and it's designed this way, so this isn't a criticism, it's much more of a free-for-all. You don't know who's behind the username. It could be somebody who started studying yesterday, somebody who claims that they have a 180 and is tutoring but doesn't. There's all sorts of different things that you see floating around. And I'm not calling anyone out in specific. It's just using possible examples of the way things actually work. I like Reddit for what it is. I just think that at the same time, you have to temper it. If you're a person who's been on a forum for a long time and you're starting to feel like it's bringing you down and it's got a toxic aspect to it, take a break, resurface, come back to it in a couple weeks and see how you feel. Nothing's going to change in the next month that is going to be groundbreaking in terms of the test, its structure, what's going to happen on your test if you're taking January or something like that. You'll be okay.
I can't beat that. Well said.
All right. And then on that note, the one thing I'll say is it's kind of like a roundtable discussion almost, John. We covered a lot of different things, but the theme was there throughout. Use these ideas that we talked about to consider whether you, as a test taker and a person practicing for the LSAT and looking at law school, are engaging in any of these behaviors that might be leading to these types of Pyrrhic victories. Are you doing something that looks like it's helpful or you think that you should be doing that ultimately isn't helpful? If even one person were to listen to this and be like, you know what, I've been making this mistake and I got to change that, this whole podcast is a victory. And I'll take that and it won't be a Pyrrhic one.
No, that's just an outright win.
All right. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and a rating. And if you have questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this was helpful. If you're taking the November LSAT, good luck on that. We will be around to recap that test the week after. So if you want to share your test experience with us, please go ahead and do that. Otherwise, stay safe and we'll talk to you soon.